Morning.
Morning.
One of the iconic family photographs from my childhood was taken at Christmas when I was probably 11 or 12 years old. My sisters and I are sitting in front of the Christmas tree in our Sunday best. I'm holding the Bible and reading to them, presumably from Luke's account of the birth of Jesus. My sisters are looking on with rapt attention, a fairly uncommon occurrence even in those days. As a child, Christmas was a magical time. Well, we did the whole Santa Claus thing. I never could quite figure out why it took my mom so long to get out to the car when we were ready to leave for church on Christmas Eve. The religious part of Christmas, including the traditional Christmas stories, were central to our celebration of the holiday. As I grew older and became more skeptical of both Santa Claus and the angels and wise men, Christmas was still an important holiday to me. I remember being pretty down the first Christmas when I was overseas as a Peace Corps volunteer and unable to be with my family. By the time we had our own children, we were no longer active in church or religion. If we happened to be home at Christmas, we'd go to church with our parents and our siblings. And even if we didn't get home, we always had a Christmas tree and celebrated the holiday in our own small family. In fact, for many years, our kids had the notion that Christmas was a 2-week holiday, with presents on several occasions as we trekked from parents to siblings during the holiday period. But even during this period of time, when religion was no longer a regular part of our lives, each Christmas, at some point, we would sit down and I would read Luke's tale of the shepherds and angels and no room at the inn for the gathered family. While we did not attend church on Christmas Eve and the primary celebration was eating a nice dinner and opening gifts, a small part of the religious aspects of the celebration remained. In later years, these rituals were expanded to include often Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol and Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Ballet. I suspect this is the way it was and probably still is in many households. But what do we really know about the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, who came to be called the Christ or the Messiah? Frankly, not a lot. Now, my source for much of this discussion this morning is from the recent historical Jesus scholarship, including Bishop Spong's essays. Given the annual kerfluffle about the so-called War on Christmas, which seems to be based on the notion that the only, or at least the preeminent, holiday of the solstice season is Christmas, it is interesting to note as a starting point how Christmas came to be celebrated on December 25th. Many of the earliest Christians did not celebrate Christmas at all, some of them arguing that celebrating the birth of a god was a pagan custom inappropriate for Christians. Others simply couldn't agree on a date. Finally, in about 276 of the Common Era, a consensus emerged around December 25th. Now, this was not because of any hard historical data, but rather because this date, around the time of the winter solstice, would compete with certain Roman pagan holidays, including one called Natalis Solis Invicti, which was the birth of the unconquered sun, and then the Persian holiday of the birthday of Mithras, son of righteousness, who was a favorite object of worship of many of the Roman soldiers. In 336, after Christianity was finally declared the state religion of the Roman Empire, December 25th became the official Christmas in the Western Church. Though even now in some parts of the Eastern Christianity, it's celebrated actually on January 6th. And there were still some holdouts. Our Puritan ancestors continued to reject any celebration of Christmas at all. And of course, many of our Christian traditions, our cherished ones, such as Christmas trees and the Yule logs, have pagan rather than Christian origins. So what about the accounts of Christmas in the Christian Bible? How historically accurate are they? Again, the answer is probably not very. The earliest Christian writings in what we now call the New Testament are the writings of Paul. He does not write about any traditions surrounding Jesus' birth, other than to note that Jesus was born of a woman and was born of the law. In other words, he was a Jewish man. In fact, that's about all Paul has to say in general about the life or teachings of Jesus. The earliest gospel, at least the ones that made it into the New Testament, is the Gospel of Mark, written about 70 of the Common Era. So who could tell me where you can find the Christmas story in Mark? Anybody? Well, I'd be surprised if you could, because there is no birth narrative in Mark. While both Matthew and Luke use much of Mark's material in composing their own Gospels, their birth narratives must have come from somewhere else. The first birth narrative is found in chapters 1 and 2 of Matthew, written about 90 of the Common Era, about 55 to 60 years after Jesus' crucifixion. It should be noted that most scholars argue that Matthew was written for a Jewish audience that, according to Spong, saw Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish hopes and dreams. In Matthew's birth narrative, Mary and Joseph live in Bethlehem, a short distance from Jerusalem. After they're engaged, but before they live together, Joseph learns that Mary is pregnant. As a righteous man, he wants to avoid embarrassment, allegedly for Mary, and decides to dismiss her quietly. But before he does this, an angel comes to him in a dream and tells him that Mary's child is from the Holy Spirit, that it is a son that he is to name Yeshua or Jesus. This was to fulfill an ancient Hebrew prophecy that a virgin will conceive and bear a son. And this seems to be the beginning of the Virgin Mary tradition. As Spong discusses at length, there are a number of linguistic and historical problems with the conclusion that Mary was a virgin, as the tradition claims. In particular, in the Hebrew scripture that's the source of the prophecy, the word that is used there, alma, might more accurately be translated as a young woman. Those who are interested may want to delve in this some more. I'm not going to be able to this morning. Now, the baby in this rendering is apparently born in Bethlehem. No manger, shepherds, or angels here. It's born in the home of Mary and Joseph. He's named Yeshua or Jesus. Sometime later, not the gospel account doesn't exactly say when, these wise men from the east, again no number is given, come to King Herod to ask about the newly born king of the Jews. So Herod asks his advisors, who consult the scriptures and conclude that this Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. Herod provides this information to the wise men and asks them to report back so that he, Herod, may also worship him. The wise men go to Bethlehem, find Jesus and his family, leave their gifts, and in response to another dream, return to their homes without reporting back to Herod. Meanwhile, the angel tells Joseph to flee with his family to Egypt to escape Herod, in which they do. In revenge, Herod orders the killing of all the firstborn sons in and around Bethlehem in hopes of eliminating his rival. This flight to Egypt and the slaughter of the innocents has echoes of the Exodus story in the Hebrew Scriptures, further connecting Jesus to the story of the Jewish people, which is an ongoing theme of the Gospel of Matthew. After the death of Herod, rather than returning to Bethlehem, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus go to the more remote village of Nazareth to avoid Herod's son Archelaus, who has replaced his father as king. This particular part of the narrative was necessary to harmonize the fact that Jesus was known all along to be from Nazareth, even though Hebrew tradition held that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. So this was how Matthew got Jesus moving from Bethlehem to Nazareth in the Galilee. Matthew says that this was to fulfill another prophecy, that Jesus was to be a Nazarene, but really it had to deal with this long-standing tradition of Jesus' home, in fact, being in Nazareth. And here in Matthew, the story of Jesus' childhood ends. The next episode of Jesus' life, reported by Matthew, is his baptism by John the Baptist about 30 years later. The Gospel of Luke, which contains the other birth narrative, was written some 6 to 10 years after Matthew. While Matthew and Luke share much material found in Mark, as well as material from a hypothetical source that many scholars call Q, Luke's Gospel contains material not found in Matthew, and vice versa. One particular point of divergence is in the birth narratives. As is clear from the reading of both stories, only in Sunday school pageants can they actually be reconciled? So Luke begins after the genealogy, or in the King James language, the begats, with a visit by the angel Gabriel to a young woman named Mary living in the village of Nazareth. She's described as a virgin who's engaged to Joseph. Gabriel tells Mary that she will conceive and bear a son who will be given the throne of David. In other words, who will be the promised Messiah, and rule over the house of Jacob forever. When Mary protests that she is a virgin, Gabriel says, in effect, don't worry, Holy Spirit will take care of that. There is then an interlude when Mary goes to visit her kinswoman Elizabeth, a woman of advanced years who has learned that she will have her own child who will become John the Baptist. There's an odd little incident where apparently the fetus of John salutes the fetus of Jesus, thus suggesting Jesus' priority to John, which addresses the question of why it was that John baptized Jesus instead of vice versa. So the story then continues with Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem, Joseph's ancestral home, in response to a purported universal census when, quote, Quirinius was governor of Syria. There's some problems with this part of the story as well. First, Jesus would have been probably 6 years old at the time Quirinius assumed his gubernatorial duties. Second, there's no historical record of an empire-wide census at that time. Though, to be fair, at least one account I read suggested there might have been a local census in Palestine to raise some tax money for local imperial purposes. But finally, there was no reason why Joseph should take his pregnant wife on a journey of 94 miles in several days when the women wouldn't be counted in the census anyway during that period of time. Theologian and scholar Rosemary Radford Rutherwright commented that only a man would come up with a story of a pregnant woman riding a donkey for 6 days in the desert. Again, the real purpose of this part of the story was to resolve the Bethlehem-Nazareth dilemma that was also faced by Matthew. How could Jesus be born in Bethlehem but be identified with Nazareth all of his life? So when Mary is ready to give birth, they can't find room at the inn of Bethlehem. This should be no surprise. If all of the descendants of King David, who included Joseph according to the story, had come for the census, simple math would put those potentially in the millions. In any event, Mary gives birth to Jesus, lays him in a manger, no mention of a stable rood here, and the angels announce the birth to the shepherds who come and pay homage. In Luke's story, 8 days later, as is customary with young Jewish males, Jesus is circumcised, and on the 40th day he's presented at the temple, after which the family returns to Nazareth. In Luke's story, there's no mention of the mysterious wise men and their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, no flight to Egypt, no slaughter of the innocents. Rather, after his somewhat miraculous conception and birth, Jesus is treated like any Jewish boy of his age. The next time he appears in Luke's gospel, he is 12 years old and at the synagogue. Now, from this brief review, it seems clear to me at least that these stories are mutually exclusive. While one could try to harmonize them, it would be quite difficult to reconcile the details. Are either of these birth narratives historically accurate? Well, we have no way of knowing for sure. The consensus of modern biblical scholarship is that they probably are not, and that they were not intended to be histories in the modern sense, but rather were designed to provide a prologue to the rest of the gospel story, leading up to the crucifixion and resurrection. The one actual historian of this period in Palestine, Josephus, does not mention any of these events. And more importantly, as discussed earlier, the earliest Christian writings prior to Matthew's gospel do not allude to these stories either, thus casting even more doubt on their authenticity. So what's the significance of all this, other than being perhaps an interesting yarn? Well, first, it is one way to engage the topic of biblical literalism. The Christmas stories present a good example of how to read the Bible in a critical way, the so-called historical critical method. By looking at the Bible in its historical context, it helps to understand what the writers meant in the context of the time when they wrote. This suggests caution in trying to apply the literal words of the Bible to our modern age. Secondly, this reconsideration of the Christmas stories reminds us of what our Unitarian forebears taught us. Jesus of Nazareth was a human being like the rest of us. His subsequent career and the memories of his followers suggest that he may have been a powerful teacher and preacher, but he had only the same spark of divinity, whatever that is present in all human beings. But his importance and influence were not dependent on his being miraculously conceived or different from any other child born the same day or night that Jesus was born. As we are reminded in many of the dedication services for infants and children in our congregations, Jesus, like the rest of us, came into the world with all the limitations inherent in our species and lived his life in this world just like the rest of us do. And this brings us to a third thought on the significance of Christmas. In traditional Christianity, Christmas is seen as a story that sets in motion the series of events that culminate in the death and resurrection of Jesus. In some considerations of the life of Jesus of Nazareth, his teachings, especially those that call upon us to care for the least of our brothers and sisters, are given second place to God's so-called plan of salvation that is based on Jesus' redemptive death for the sins of all humankind. Thus, in much of Protestant Christianity, a greater emphasis is placed on the book of John, which focused on the divine Christ rather than on Jesus, the preacher and the healer. To the extent that attention is paid to Jesus' teachings at all, they are often interpreted in the context of the greater salvation narrative. In this context, literal acceptance of the Christmas stories with their otherworldly aspects helps to bolster the broader salvation theme. Baptist minister and scholar and civil rights activist Howard Thurman, however, suggests another way to look at the significance of the Christmas story. Thurman writes, "When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the king and the princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among people, to make music in the heart." As we approach Christmas this year, we are challenged to remember these words. A couple of weeks ago, fast food workers staged walkouts and work stoppages to bring attention to the low pay and difficult working conditions that many of them face. Over $5 billion in cuts to the food stamp program have already taken effect, and Congress is considering even larger cuts, perhaps as much as $40 billion more. Food pantries are seeing greater demand for their services, with over 49 million people in the United States alone considered food insecure at some time during the year. And many of those needing food stamps and food pantry assistance are persons who are working, but whose wages and hours are inadequate to allow them to support themselves and their families. Pope Francis and the nuns on the bus have stirred up a controversy among politicians and the bloviating classes by suggesting that we have a religious and moral obligation not only to provide private charity, but also public economic justice to all. Our original sin is not Eve eating the apple in the Garden of Eden, but rather our failure to deal fairly and justly with those with whom we share this planet. As healthcare reform begins to be implemented, one of the subtexts for many of its opponents is that it is unfair that some of us should pay more for insurance so that others may pay less. Now, one might quarrel with the mechanism being used to spread the cost under the Affordable Care Act. I, for one, believe a tax system would be better. But I think the fundamental principle is sound. We have a basic responsibility to care for one another through the collective activity we call government. As Thurman points out, the important part of the Christmas story is not what may or may not have happened that night or day of Jesus' birth, Rather, what is important is what that self-same Jesus of Nazareth taught 30 years later, and how we respond to his teaching. Even if we do not identify ourselves as Christians, Jesus' message of love and concern for our fellow human beings is a universal message of peace on earth and goodwill to all creatures, human and others. Or in the immortal words of Tiny Tim, God bless us, every one. And so Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and blessings for all.